Welcome to the Capitol Forum's Antitrust Interview Series sponsored by Kroll on Track. I'm Sally Hubbard, and I'm delighted to be here with Deb Garza, a partner in the Washington office of Covington and Burling, and a former acting assistant attorney general in charge of the antitrust division. Deb, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
So some have claimed that the current U.S. and global regulatory environment is the most aggressive toward mega deals than it has been in decades. Do you agree with that idea?
I don't actually agree with it, and I've seen a lot of statements to that effect, comparing it really not so much to past decades, but even, believe it or not, to the last 5 years of the beginning part of the Obama administration. And I don't think that it's been strikingly more aggressive. I do think it's been aggressive, but I think what we're seeing is a larger number of very large strategic transactions that inherently are presenting competitive issues that are being examined under standards that have evolved over time, that aren't different, that are consistent with other standards, and being assessed in terms of the remedies, the effectiveness of the remedies, very much like how they've been assessed in the past. But we are seeing a larger number of these transactions being proposed, and we're seeing a not too surprising number of challenges. And we are seeing more of these cases going to court than had previously been the case, and it still is the case that a lot of transactions don't get challenged, and that many of them that do get challenged are settled through a consent decree, through some sort of viable fix. What we're seeing now is an increasing number of these transactions where the remedies are more difficult and where parties are actually putting the government to the proof. So I think what's changed is probably, in some sense, not the aggressiveness of the government, but the willingness of parties to go to court. In the past, I think it's been very rare for companies to go to court to defend a transaction, in part because it's really hard to hold a deal together long enough to be going through an investigation for 6 months, 9 months, and then to litigate for another 5 or 6 months. You lose your customers, your supplier relationships, your employee relationships, all of that suffers during that long period of uncertainty. And so for that reason, when a fix is viable, where the parties can still achieve substantially what they hope to achieve through the transaction, it makes more sense for them to restructure the transaction than to litigate. And then what we have been seeing, I think, in some of these other transactions recently being litigated is they're very important to the companies, and it's more difficult to find a solution that will preserve the value of the deal. And so you see companies litigating. Companies are negotiating their merger agreements to require them to stick through litigation. They're balancing the risks through breakup fees and other things, and they're just taking the chance of putting the government to its proof, which I, as an antitrust lawyer and a former policymaker, think is a good idea. I think it's better. It's maybe not be better for everybody, but I think it's good to have well-developed case law, to have the courts focus on the circumstances in which the government is bringing challenges, and to focus on whether the challenges are correctly brought. And so I think having some litigation, having some court decisions will actually be very good, as opposed to just simply having sort of law made through a consent decree.
So that's interesting. It's almost, in your view, that it's the merging parties that are being a bit more aggressive in terms of being willing to litigate, as opposed to antitrust enforcers actually being more aggressive.
I think that's right. I mean, in my experience, at various times that I've been in the government, it was never the case that if the party said they were going to litigate, if we had to go to court, we said, well, never mind, you can do the transaction. Or if we decided that there were particular competitive concerns raised, we would then determine what it is we thought we needed to fix it. And while you could talk to the parties about, how the parameters of the fix, you really didn't negotiate the fix in that sense. I mean, you don't, for institutional reasons, once you identified a problem, you have to address it, and you don't give up on that just because you have to litigate. I've never known the agencies to be afraid of litigation. And so I don't really think, and I could be, other people may disagree, but I don't think that the government has changed in that regard. I think they certainly have made efforts to improve their ability and readiness to go to court and litigate. But in terms of that decision calculus, whether to litigate or not, in my view, it's always been the case that whenever the government has challenged a transaction or made up its mind to challenge a transaction, it was always assumed that you would have to defend that in court. So, and like I said before, parties have in the past generally not thought it to be in their interest to do that. They may not want to restructure a transaction where it can be restructured, but when they balance it out, it makes more sense for them to restructure it and go forward with the deal. And in these cases, as I mentioned, I think what would be required to restructure hasn't been attractive, or in some cases, like the Justice Department is explaining with their view with respect to Baker Hughes Halliburton, there may not be a fix, right? It may just cover too many aspects of the business to be able to fix the competitive concerns with an adequate divestiture. So,
do you think the difficulty of finding a divestiture that fixes the problem is related to the deals being bigger and bigger?
Well, it's related to the nature of the deals. I think it's easier to get a fix if you have a transaction where there's an isolated business and where it's a whole business as opposed to just pulling out assets. So if you have a multi-line business and that's affected by the merger, then you can divest that. If you have lots of parts of the business, then it's going to be more difficult. So it's because you're not going to divest a whole business. Then we start talking about doing specific assets and parts of the business and actually trying in a very short time period to create something that didn't exist before, and that's just much more difficult.
And do you think that the recent experiences with some failed divestitures have influenced how the enforcers are looking at divestitures?
I would assume. I mean, it would influence me. When you never want to agree to a failed fix. A failed fix is a failure of an enforcement policy, right? And you have a responsibility as a government enforcer. If I've identified what I truly believe to be competitive harm, I have to address it, and I want to address it with an adequate fix. And there's always a little bit of uncertainty about success. In the past, I think that, largely the remedies have been successful. The FTC has from time to time, as you probably know, gone back to reevaluate those remedies, which is, I think, important to see whether or not they were doing what they were intended to do. But when you see failures like we've seen recently, where the divestiture buyer goes bankrupt or exits the markets shortly thereafter, you have to examine why that happened and whether it was an inadequacy of the fix, and you have to learn from it. So notwithstanding those failures, there have continued to be fixes to transactions, but I'm assuming that the government's being very much more careful in evaluating the divestiture buyers and appreciating how readily they'll be able to really literally step into the shoes of the acquired entity and maintain the status quo. And one thing I will say is that what sometimes I think what companies don't realize is that the fix is supposed to maintain the status quo. That's how the government approaches it.
Right.
I want to see no change. I want to see it exactly as it has been. Now that's not going to happen, because when you divest something, you put it into something, you're not going to see exactly, no interruption and necessarily see everything be exactly the status quo. But I think businesses don't quite understand that. And so when you approach a fix, that's the thing you have to have in mind, the status quo. So, and that's why sometimes just giving a package of contracts without necessary assets or just giving partial assets isn't necessarily going to restore the status quo. And if I'm the Justice Department, by the way, when I settle a case, I have a Tunney Act requirement. I have to explain why what I've accepted is adequate. How do I explain that unless I can do it with some degree of certainty? So I think that it has, for that reason, had impact. It's good government, I think, to make sure that you don't repeat mistakes.
So in your view, then, it's not the case that mergers that are getting blocked in, say, 2015 would have sailed through in 2013. You don't see any kind of change in enforcement standards in recent years.
I don't think so. I think there may be there haven't been any changes in standards. The standards have been evolving. It's, 'cause, the predictions that we make when we look at a merger about what the effect is going to be they're inherently, there's an inherent uncertainty to that. They are predictions, but the methods we use and the way people look at it are known and pretty much the same. There may be some differences on the margin. I mean, I won't say that there's completely no difference from administration to administration or over time, because certain people may have a little bit more risk aversity. And so, a lot of times when I was in government, there were very close calls as to whether or not there would likely be a competitive effect. And so I think it's possible that one person might, cast that, might look at that close call and decide, I'm going to err on the side of enforcing, and whereas someone else might say, I'm going to err on the side of not enforcing. So there may be some small changes there, but in general, I don't think the standards have changed. And it would be difficult, I think, for there to be a dramatic change in approach now, because ultimately the agency does have to go to court and does have to prove its case. And so you have to be able to prove your case. When you have guidelines out there, there are certain settled ideas about how you look at these things. You're going to have to prove an anti-competitive effect. So you can't wildly change the standards, and it's not my perception that the agencies have.
Right, yeah, that's the interesting thing that people seem to always or at least people in the mainstream media or society at large seem to forget, that in the U.S. the antitrust agencies have to prove their case in court.
Right.
And a lot of the times the agencies have actually tried to move the doctrine a little bit, like for instance focusing more on competitive effects, but yet they still have courts that require them to define a product market.
Exactly.
and focus on a more structural
Right.
analysis.
And and a good thing to show how this goes is to look at what's been going on in the Staples Office Depot case.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a case where obviously the Federal Trade Commission thinks that it has a case, right? It's convinced that there would be an anti-competitive effect, so it goes to court to get a preliminary injunction, and you can see, the judge's skepticism. We don't know how he's going to rule yet, but at least you can see the questions and the skepticism. So for those who might say, well, we just need to be more aggressive, and we just need to be inventive, and we need to think of new ways to challenge these mergers, well, look at that case, look how it's being tried. The government has a burden to prove that there's going to be an anti-competitive effect, and it's not easy to just change your standards. But this is why, in part, why I think it's healthy to have litigated challenges. It would be nice, I think, if it were possible to have more in a more compressed period of time, potentially, to give companies the options to litigate. I think that there are other deals where the companies might have liked to litigate the challenge but didn't feel they could because the investigation had already gone on so long and they just couldn't hold the deal together. Or in the case of the FTC, there would still be too much uncertainty about the possibility of going into a Part 3 situation. So I actually think that it's good to litigate to build up the case law.
Do you think that parties are more apprehensive to litigate against the FTC than the DOJ because of the Part 3 process?
I think it definitely has an impact on their assessment of risk and their willingness to keep a deal together. The FTC process, I think, inherently raises the possibility that that a deal won't get done, because of the fact that whereas if the DOJ goes to court and doesn't get a preliminary injunction, they usually combine the injunction, preliminary and final injunction, but if they don't get the court order, then that's it. That's the end of it. They could appeal. They don't often appeal. And at the Federal Trade Commission, you do have that prospect of you don't get the injunction, the parties close the deal, but the deal still is at risk of being unwound. And that has a very big impact on the willingness of a buyer to engage in the transaction. And it's the reason I support the Smarter Act, and it's the reason the Antitrust Modernization Commission recommended that the standards be the same. And there seems to be a problem if you go to the court and the court doesn't give the FTC a preliminary injunction, that transaction could still have to go through Part 3 proceedings. So I do think that right now, as the law is currently structured, there's more inherent uncertainty and risk with a transaction that will be looked at by the FTC. And of course, we don't always know whether a transaction will be looked at by the FTC.
Right, it's not always predictable at the outset. Another interesting thing that's happening in antitrust is that antitrust is becoming more of a part of the popular discourse.
Right.
You know, we're hearing politicians talking about antitrust as part of their candidacy. And of course, simultaneously, we're having some populist movements on both the left and the right. Do you think that there could be some possibility of returning to the kind of more populist origins and less technocratic approach to antitrust as a result of this political kind of temperature in the country?
Well, it'll be interesting to see. As you say, I think during this election, I think Bernie Sanders, with his progressive agenda, appears to have been moving the Democratic Hillary Clinton a little bit more on the progressive agenda, and we do see more populism. We see people being frightened by the mega mergers and uncertain about them, and senators talking about maybe we need to find new ways of dealing with this and find inventive ways of dealing with it. So it's possible that could persist, but then we have this legal framework, and so the question is, what does that really mean? And there may be reasons to be concerned about the consolidation that go beyond the typical antitrust concern. In the defense industry, people have raised the concern about even if there's not a traditional antitrust problem in a line of business, maybe you have to preserve the base. And I mean, that's probably legitimate to look at, but I don't think that we can approach that question through the antitrust laws. And I have some concern about the ability of the antitrust agencies and the courts to deal with consolidation with respect to other things besides the impact on price and innovation. So if we're worried about, like Hillary Clinton has said something about worrying about the effect of consolidation on wage stagnation, or other people may have expressed a concern about whether it's just bargaining power kind of things. I think when you get to those sort of situations, that antitrust laws and the methods and tools that we aren't really adequate to deal with that. So I would be worried about trying to enforce the laws with some sort of vague idea of bigness being bad, or some sort of concept of, wage stagnation being an issue. I don't know that we have the tools to look at transactions with that in mind. And I worry about agencies looking at transactions when they're untethered to the standards as they've evolved, because then you have a lot of uncertainty, and then people start reacting to transactions without sufficient information and without a very good sense of what the costs are of stopping transactions and what the basis for stopping them is. And so I worry about any kind of dramatic sort of change to how we deal with these transactions based on sort of populist ideas that haven't been fleshed out, that aren't connected to, sound economic analysis, et cetera.
But it may be that because there hasn't been a lot of litigation, that actually the standards that we haven't really been, kind of vetted enough, as much as legal standards are put to the test in other areas of law where you have much more rampant litigation. So it's interesting to think that actually more cases could flesh out the standards and could actually change the nature of the tools that
it's possible.
Has.
And I think the Federal Trade Commission is a perfect institution to try to get and look at some of these issues. Well, again, what has merger enforcement been effective? What to the extent we can test, what's been the effect of consolidation? People are suggesting there's a link between consolidation and wage stagnation. Is there even? I think it's good to take a look at these issues. As somebody mentioned recently, maybe we need another antitrust modernization commission. Yeah, I would rather see that, have someone do that, and have us really look at these issues than to go off before we've examined them and start blocking transactions or restructuring transactions in a way based on these ideas. But it's true. We and one of the things the AMC said is that we're not very good diagnosing how well we've done. And so the antitrust agencies make big decisions on mergers, and there's very little sort of looking back, in part because it's hard to do that. But almost any other enterprise, you try to measure your effectiveness by looking back and then adjusting forward, and we don't do that very well in antitrust. I mean, the remedies thing is one area where we do. Go back and look and see whether your remedies have been effective, so you know what to do going forward. But I do think there's a need to go back and consider, are we doing the right thing? Should we make adjustments? And I think it's healthy to do that periodically.
Well, Deb, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We've got a lot to think about after this conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you.